Welcome to Didactic Residency Edition. Today is Sunday, December 3rd, and I am Dr. O'Leary, a fourth-year psychiatry resident in the National Capital Region. If this is your first time here, welcome. This is a podcast about psychiatry and neuroscience. I do it as a way to help myself learn, and I hope I can help you as well. It's designed for psychiatry residents, but I think it can be just as helpful for residents of other specialties, any attending physicians, medical students, or anyone just interested in psychiatry, psychology, or neuroscience. I am compelled to let you know that this podcast is, at this moment, solely my own venture. So nothing I say here should be construed as anyone else's opinion, especially not the federal government, the Department of Defense, or the Viltrumite Alliance. It is also not an endorsement of any particular medicine or any particular company that produces or distributes these medicines. The only conflicts of interest that I have that I'm aware of are my interests between my job and my leisure activities. Today, I want to talk about dopamine. I've mentioned it before. In episode 32, I discussed the pseudoscientific trend of dopamine detox or a dopamine fasting. That's this recurrent craze promoted on social media, especially by doctors who want to sell you their special brand of nutrient supplements or get sponsorship from companies selling their own particular life hacks, or they have a book out that they want you to buy. But instead of talking about pseudoscience, I want to talk about some of the actual science surrounding dopamine and its relationships with some of the drugs that we psychiatrists give frequently. Specifically, I will talk about neuroleptics, or antipsychotics as they're more commonly known now, and how they interact with the neurons in the major dopamine networks in the brain. But first, I need to back up to, say, 1950, or the 1950s in particular. The first antipsychotic widely used was chlorpromazine, and it was marketed as Thorazine. It had been under development as an antihistaminic drug, and it does also have these properties, but then it was found to block dopamine receptors, specifically D2 receptors. And this was more incidentally or accidentally discovered because they noticed that giving people Thorazine would make them, say, kind of very calm without putting them to sleep. It was later found to treat some of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia and of mania. Because of its ability to reduce hallucinations, agitations, mania, and kind of abnormal goal-seeking behaviors in general, it was called a major tranquilizer. The term antipsychotic became popular about 10 years later. In the 1950s, drugs didn't actually need to go through the kind of approval process that they do now through the FDA to get them on the shelves. Mostly it was just word of mouth and promotion by drug companies and other doctors. So as a result, Thorazine was initially used for just about every psychiatric condition you could imagine, where they kind of wanted to sedate without making people sleepy, make them more calm, less agitated. But over time, the downsides of antipsychotics like Thorazine were becoming more apparent. So blocking D2 receptors could result in dystonias, like rigidity in certain muscles, or akathisia, this feeling of restlessness where you just cannot become comfortable. And over time could result in something called tardive dyskinesia, which is most often permanent motor disorder. Also, many antipsychotics affect other receptors. Like I've mentioned the histamine receptors, but there's also muscarinic receptors, alpha receptors, serotonin receptors, and more. And this can cause things like weight gain, like metabolic syndromes, like with high blood sugar and high blood fats, neutropenia, and even agranulocytosis, where the body quits making certain types of white blood cells. Initially, it was thought that, well, too much dopamine in the brain was really kind of the cause of schizophrenia or of mania. So people who take large doses of stimulants, for example, we know that these increase available dopamine in the brain, and if they do this over long periods of time or just take a whole lot at once, they can become psychotic. But this is often associated with these people using the substances not sleeping very well or not eating very much because they also suppress the appetite. And we know that not sleeping for days at a time can also cause psychosis. We also know that there are drugs that block like glutamate receptors, like ketamine or PCP, and their effects can mimic psychosis as well. Also, strong like anticholinergic blockade is associated with psychotic symptoms. Med students might remember the mnemonic for an anticholinergic toxidrome that includes symptoms such as like dry as a bone, mad as a hatter, high as a kite. So in specific datura, or it's also called loco weed, it contains seeds with really potent anticholinergic effects, and they're used at times for either recreational or you could say ceremonial activities, and also can be fatal. So we have the anticholinergics, and we have the anti-glutamatergics, and we also have maybe too much dopamine, all of which look very psychotic. But it was also noticed that drugs like LSD and psilocybin can cause psychotic symptoms, and they primarily stimulate serotonin receptors. And there are now antipsychotic medications like pimavanserin that control psychotic symptoms primarily by blocking serotonin receptors, along with all the many atypical antipsychotic agents that are more likely to block certain serotonin receptors than they are to block D2 receptors, though they usually do both. So these observations have resulted in like many different hypotheses for the genesis of psychosis that are really, I don't think, mutually exclusive, but they each focus attention on, say, different neurotransmitters or neurotransmitter systems, whether they be like serotonin, glutamate, dopamine, or even acetylcholine. But today, I'm going to focus on the role of dopamine and also serotonin receptors in various parts of the brain, because these are intimately linked in kind of this exquisite and fragile dance of neural activity that keeps our thoughts organized, grounded in reasonable probabilistic outcomes, and able to distinguish between things like externally and internally derived perceptions. It will also help me to facilitate a discussion about neuroleptics or antipsychotics or major tranquilizers or whatever you want to call them, which I will go into in more excruciating detail in a future episode. Dopamine is a neuromodulator or neurotransmitter that is produced and shipped through at least four major pathways. There are others, but I'm going to focus down on actually three of four major pathways. So one dopaminergic neuron might synapse with thousands of other neurons. And of the target neurons that it's synapsing with, they might be receiving projections from hundreds of dopamine neurons. So this is all to say that this network is extensive, and it basically helps to set the tone, or it's also been called the gain in the brain, by modulating kind of how fast or frequently other neurons fire. The dopamine pathways are named the mesolimbic, mesocortical, nigrostriatal, and tuberoinfundibular pathways. Like I mentioned, there are many other less extensive pathways, but I'm going to ignore those for now. Neurologists have done us a favor by naming things based on like where they start and where they end up. So the mesocortical pathway starts in the midbrain, the meso part of the brain. And in the midbrain, it's this place called the ventral tegmental area. And then it ends up in cortical regions, especially the prefrontal cortex, hence mesocortical. The mesolimbic pathway also starts in the midbrain's ventral tegmental area, and it ends up in our limbic system, especially in the nucleus accumbens, among other things that I'll get into later. The nigrostriatal pathway starts in the substantia nigra. It's also in the midbrain, but it's separated from the ventral tegmental area, and it ends up in the striatum, especially the dorsal part of the striatum. So it should be noted that there's also like this mesostriatal pathway from the ventral tegmental to the ventral striatum, but this is considered part of the limbic system. So that's considered to be part of the mesolimbic pathway. And finally, there is the tuberoinfundibular pathway, and it starts, well, okay, I'm not going to put you to sleep with that. I'll save that one for later. But let's start with the mesolimbic pathway. This is the pathway that feeds dopamine from the ventral tegmental area in the midbrain to much of the limbic system, which includes the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the ventral striatum, and the amygdala, as well as the anterior cingulate gyrus, some of the medial parts of the prefrontal cortex, those parts right in the center of the brain between the two lobes, and the hippocampal formations on the medial temporal lobe. It also connects with other areas of the brain that are not usually highlighted, such as like the lateral hypothalamus and the lateral mammillary bodies. In short, it helps fuel the part of our brains that are the most fundamental for survival, including like memory, feeding behaviors, motivation, and reward seeking, as well as avoidance of aversive stimuli and threats. So that's what the limbic system does. So with regard to psychotic symptoms, malfunction of the limbic system can contribute to a lot of the negative symptoms, such as like apathy or anhedonia, kind of a general lack of drive, like failing to eat or to care for oneself. They might call that withdrawal. It can result in inattention to any particular subject or a general kind of amotivation. In terms of positive symptoms, like the limbic connections likely can help drive things like delusions of grandeur or persecutory delusions where you feel under threat all the time, or erotomania, delusions of love, or maybe even excess goal-driven behaviors. So the affective states can contribute to positive or negative symptoms. I mean, for example, fear tends to reduce feeding and grooming behaviors. So someone who is overtly kind of paranoid also might be less likely to be eating or maybe washing themselves or um, participating in the basic behaviors that someone might do if they were comfortable and at peace. Dopamine blocking agents acting on the mesolimbic system may mimic the negative symptoms of schizophrenia with this kind of affective blunting and a reduction in some of these goal-directed behaviors. So the mesolimbic system itself in schizophrenia might result in this sort of amotivated picture, but also adding antipsychotics on might contribute to some of that as well. Next is the mesocortical pathway. So the mesocortical pathway ships dopamine to the prefrontal cortex among some other cortical regions. But the prefrontal cortex does a lot for us. It contains a large part of our working memory. And it helps us to regulate those emotions that the limbic system is concerned about. And it helps us to do things like pick out the most important details from our current environment to consider and ignoring the rest. It can help us to decide between competing choices. It can let us know when our experiences don't match our expectations and maybe even help us figure out why. It can help us to understand social cues, to plan for the future, and many other things. So in chronic relapsing psychotic illnesses such as schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, there's often kind of this prodromal phase accompanied by things like changes in personality, lack of concern for forming or maintaining social relationships, or for conforming to social norms. Like college students might suddenly have poor academic performance, inability to meet their goals. They're not hanging out with their friends anymore. And they become kind of obsessed on things that they never really were obsessed with before. So these kind of negative cognitive symptoms of psychotic illnesses often are the first to develop before the like frank hallucinations and the disorganized behavior. And they can have a long, insidious onset. All of these kinds of things involve dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex, or how it's communicating with the limbic system. The mesocortical pathway and the dopamine it employs helps us to regulate these kind of networks and to keep them functioning in tandem with, and at times like separate from or an anti-correlation with other brain regions, like the default mode network. I've talked about this before, but For example, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is part of your central executive network, and it should at times be anti-correlating with your default mode network. But if they're both kind of on at the same time, that can result in uh, the inability to kind of get out of ruminative thought, to be able to, for the executive parts of your brain to regulate the more affective parts of your brain. With regard to like behaviors, the prefrontal cortex is also in competition with the limbic system to help us learn things and to direct our behaviors. So the cortex is more deliberate. It's like slower to make decisions. It considers more information in a certain time period than the limbic system does. The limbic system is more quick to decide things and to direct our actions. The prefrontal cortex has been described as being responsible for what we call effort learning, which may require things like delayed gratification, while the limbic system is more concerned with more immediate rewards and like putting the least amount of effort necessary into getting them. It's also been shown that, like, say, errors generated by both of these systems with regard to like expected outcomes are processed in the ventral striatum. That's part of our limbic system, in order to come up with some kind of final decision or like compromise on what to do next. The ability to make decisions like this in a complex way is often impaired in psychosis, and the complexity of those decisions um, and what information is considered has a lot to do with how well the prefrontal cortex is operating. In terms of kind of other psychotic symptoms like disorganized behavior and speech, um, that can also be affected by the dysfunction of the prefrontal cortex. The next pathway is the nigrostriatal pathway, and it's quite a bit different from the mesocortical and mesolimbic pathways. Regardless of how well we can organize our thinking or, say, control our emotional states or predict the future, we really can't do anything without the nigrostriatal pathway functioning well. So overall, there's kind of some tonic level of signals coming from our motor cortex to our muscles, and these are systematically suppressed, or you could say fine-tuned, in the dorsal striatum. Like in Parkinson's disease, where the substantia nigra is degenerating and dopamine levels are low, the striatum malfunctions and people develop like tremors, rigidity, difficulty relaxing muscles, or even difficulty initiating or coordinating actions. The nigrostriatal pathway primarily involves dopaminergic neurons that originate in the substantia nigra and then terminate in the dorsal striatum. So this striatum is roughly divided into two regions. You could say the dorsal striatum is more involved directly in motor functions and also influences some cognitive functions via the corticostriatal thalamocortical tract. The ventral striatum, the part that's more considered limbic, is associated with other limbic structures and in reward versus risk kind of processing, in learning, and in uh, prediction error processing. With regard to the striatum and psychosis, there appears to be like deficits in facilitating complex behaviors and making decisions when there's conflicting information. So the dorsal striatum is more likely involved in learning things like habitual automated actions and in coordinating like near reflexive actions, not the ones that are complete reflexes, but the ones that need to happen fast. And also ones that, you've practiced over and over and over again. Like if you are a ballet dancer and you're perfecting your pirouette, the dorsal striatum is going to, when it gets the signal to do that, be able to facilitate that very quickly. The ventral striatum is more like learning intentional actions, things that we have to really kind of think out and plan out de novo in some cases, like how to navigate a new course in, say, an Ironman competition you're doing for the first time. The dorsal striatum is going to have a lot of those basic actions down, like how to climb a wall, but the ventral striatum is going to be more involved in like deciding what to do next or what path to take. The striatum in particular can also help regulate obsessive thoughts. So if the striatum is disrupted, it becomes difficult to learn and someone becomes, well, stuck or obsessed with things. that in reality may have very little salience. So in severe mood disorders and some psychotic disorders, disruption of the striatum might also play a role in catatonia. With chronic use of neuroleptics, the development of like akathisia, dystonias, tardive dyskinesia, or neuroleptic malignant syndrome almost certainly involves dopamine blockade in the dorsal striatum. Next is the tuberoinfundibular pathway. It's the one I kind of skipped over earlier. So certain antipsychotics have very high rates of hyperprolactinemia associated with them, which is increase in prolactin in your blood. Antipsychotics like risperidone do this, and it's due to effects of blocking dopamine within the tuberoinfundibular pathway. And this pathway runs basically from the hypothalamus to the infundibulum of the pituitary, like the pituitary stalk. If you inhibit this dopamine signaling, it will increase the release of prolactin. So basically, blocking the action of dopamine here causes more prolactin to be released, which can cause side effects such as breast swelling, milk production, or even like sexual dysfunction. That is the honorable mention that the infundibular pathway gets today. But we'll talk about it a little bit more when I talk about the antipsychotics specifically in the future. Here, I would also like to mention that although our language makes it sound like all of the dopaminergic neurons to the dorsal striatum come from the substantia nigra, and all the cortical and limbic dopaminergic neurons come from the ventral tegmental area, but this may not be strictly true. There's probably some overlap. So some tracks are dominant, but really not like exclusive. Also, information kind of flows both ways, even indirectly. So there's this like feedback from the cortical and limbic regions to the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra. There are also not like only dopaminergic neurons projecting from the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra. There are also populations of, for example, glutamatergic neurons in these areas that follow parallel efferent pathways with the dopaminergic neurons. So that's all to say that to characterize these regions as dopaminergic is true, but incomplete. I mentioned previously that the striatum feeds back to the cortex, and this might happen through like thalamic connections. So the thalamus is also intimately involved in everything that's going on here. So let me right now just I'm going to discuss one study. This was a study in transgenic mice, and it was designed to well, the mice were designed to have this relative increase in D2 receptor expression in the striatum. And when they increased the D2 receptor expression, it showed decreased GABAergic action in the prefrontal cortex, which meant that the prefrontal cortex was like more sensitive to dopamine. And additionally, when they stimulated D2 receptors in the striatum, it resulted in signals to the ventral tegmental area that reduced tonic dopamine delivery to the prefrontal cortex. So more dopamine shipped to the striatum could result in less dopamine being available to the prefrontal cortex. Not because it's being used up, but because it's being suppressed by signals from the striatum back to the ventral tegmental area. But now that I have completely lost your attention, I want to move on to the mechanism of action of antipsychotics that I first mentioned and discuss that a little bit. Honestly, I don't think we really fully know how they control psychosis or what actually even eventually causes psychosis, but we do know that the original antipsychotics were strong D2 blockers, and this led to some improvements, especially in the positive symptoms of psychosis and in dampening down mania. So some models suggest something to the effect of, well, there's an excess dopamine throughout the brain, or at least in certain parts of the brain, which is like turning up the gain on different brain regions. And this, in turn, causes them to be either far more active or far easier to be activated than they usually are, which results basically in a lot more noise. And this noise makes it hard to think and hard to pay attention and hard to follow logical thought and hard to make decisions. and hard to distinguish between internally and externally generated signals. And over time, things like this will result in neuronal cell death, or maybe loss of synaptic connections between different regions, or downregulation of certain synaptic receptors. So this model likely has some truth to it, but it is, it's pretty oversimplistic, and it doesn't account for the wide range of different kinds of psychotic symptoms, or the fact that psychotic symptoms are not limited to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia or mania, and also occur, for example, in things like depression with psychotic features, or even PTSD, or in brief psychotic episodes that were not substance-induced, or even in delirium. Psychosis seems to be a state of like brain failure, and it can result from what appear to be many different things. And D2 blockers can help put things back into, you could say, a relative balance. I say a relative overactivity because in the brains of people with chronic psychotic disorders, there's often kind of a global volume loss with decreased gray matter. And also, compared with controls, different brain regions may appear less connected with each other. So it is unclear what the brains of people with like prodromal psychotic illnesses look like. I don't think we have that data, very good data anyway. There's also the fact that none of our neurotransmitters are acting alone. Dopamine receptors are on glutamatergic or GABAergic or serotonergic neurons as well, and they regulate the release of those neurotransmitters, and vice versa, and intraversa, and extraversa, and into the spider versa. So with respect to the antipsychotics, we use the most common receptors other than the D2 receptors that pharmacological agents act on are serotonin receptors, especially the 5-HT2A receptor. The cell bodies and terminal regions of all three dopaminergic pathways I just talked about receive inputs from serotonergic neurons originating in the raphe nuclei. Neurons that are part of the mesolimbic and mesocortical systems have 5-HT2A receptors that help regulate their activity. Blocking these receptors reduces the transmission of dopamine to the cortex and the limbic system. And this may be why the antipsychotics that block 5-HT2A, a serotonin receptor, help reduce psychotic symptoms in many people. However, it's different in the nigrostriatal pathway because blocking 5-HT2 receptors in the nigrostriatal pathway have been reported to kind of have the opposite effect on dopamine signaling. It increases the activation of dopamine neurons to the dorsal striatum. So this can explain maybe why antipsychotics that have a greater affinity for 5-HT2A versus D2 receptors also have a far lower potential to cause movement disorders. These are like many of what we call the second generation or atypical antipsychotics. And they don't block D2 receptors as strongly as they do 5-HT2 receptors frequently. And then there are some new, or you could say novel antipsychotics that don't block D2 receptors at all. And these have very low rates of extrapyramidal symptoms or dystonias. So to summarize that real quick, in the mesolimbic and the mesocortical pathway, if you block 5-HT2A, you overall dampen down the amount of dopamine being delivered to these areas. But in the nigrostriatal pathway, if you block 5-HT2A, you may be increasing the amount of dopamine delivered to these areas. And this can help explain some of the side effect profiles that are different between some of the new or novel antipsychotics, the second generation antipsychotics, and the more strict D2 blocking antipsychotics. Another possible action of the 5-HT2 receptor, like antagonists, or some of them are actually reverse agonists, not antagonists, but I'll get to that later, it's to help regulate glutamate release in the cortex. At the cellular level, 5-HT2A receptors are highly expressed on cortical glutamatergic pyramidal cells, where they regulate pyramidal cell excitability. So antipsychotics that block 5-HT2A may be exerting their effects by modulating both glutamate and dopamine simultaneously. Also, some of the antipsychotics or their metabolites are 5-HT1A agonists, which can increase dopamine release in the prefrontal cortex and reduce glutamate release, which is potentially having pro-cognitive effects. But I want to stop here for today. That's a lot of this does this and this does that. To summarize, the T2 blockers are really causing a lot of their side effects by maybe reducing the ability of the prefrontal cortex to consider complex information, so maybe having anti-cognitive effects. They're reducing the ability of the affective network to range the same way it does, kind of blunting it down. And these can mimic the negative side effects of schizophrenia. But in the dorsal striatum, blocking D2 is going to be causing a lot of the dystonias, the extrapyramidal effects, and eventually tardive dyskinesia. There's also a blocking of dopamine receptors in the tuberoinfundibular pathway, which is going to cause prolactinemia. Some of the antipsychotics kind of get around this. Instead of blocking dopamine, they block 5-HT2A, which will decrease dopamine release into the cortex and the limbic system, but potentially increase it to the dorsal striatum. So this is why they don't have the same kinds of side effects, especially movement side effects, that the strong D2 blocking agents do. So I just discussed in some detail 3 of the dopaminergic pathways that are thought to be causally involved in the symptoms of some patients with psychosis. I've discussed some of the ways in which these models that we've used so far are probably vastly oversimplistic, and that we're learning more about how complicated these systems really are. And I've summarized kind of how the main mechanisms of the action of neuroleptics affect dopamine in these pathways and on the regions that these pathways supply. So in the next episode, I want to discuss in detail many of the particular antipsychotics that are available, what they do, and how this results in their efficacy and their side effects and the dangers of giving these over long periods of time. Thank you for listening. I am Dr. O, and this has been an episode of Psydactic Residency Edition.